Gotta make that face. Today we're gonna do a product shot, and I have one of my favorite guitars here. This is a 1996 Fender Telecaster Plus. And since everybody's kind of quarantined around the world, I thought it would be fun to do some sort of product shot with this guitar and maybe make a fake ad that you might want to create for your own website, or if you were hired to do a commercial job for a company like Fender. So without any further ado, let's get into it. That's my best Eric Johnson. All right, so here we are on set. In a minute, I'm gonna tell you exactly why I set everything up the way that it is, but first, let me talk about our first sponsor for this video, which is Tamron's brand new 35 to 150 millimeter zoom lens. This versatile zoom lens gives you an incredibly wide field of view while still offering a fast f2.8 to f4 aperture. This means that you can easily shoot both in low light, or you can blur out your backgrounds if you're shooting portraits. This 35mm to 150mm lens is designed both for Canon and Nikon DSLRs. It has super fast silent focusing, vibration compensation that'll give you sharp photos and stable video, and state-of-the-art lens coatings to keep up with the highest resolution cameras. Check out the link in the description below to learn even more about one of the most popular lenses Tamron has released this year. Now for this particular photo shoot, I'm going to be using Tamron's 24 to 70mm lens because in this confined shoot, I think I'm going to have to shoot a little bit wider than 35mm. But let me go ahead and tell you what I've got set up here. So right here, I have a Manfrotto tripod, and what I like about this tripod is it allows me to change the orientation of the ball head so that I can boom it up over my subject. This is going to be really handy because the idea for this shoot is to shoot straight down on this guitar. To prevent this tripod from wobbling and to make sure it's nice and secure, I've also put this heavy sandbag right in the middle of the tripod. So with the center column boomed out over my guitar, I'm now able to mount my camera. This is a Nikon D850, and now I can have the camera directly over the guitar. And what's nice about the Nikon D850 is it has this articulating screen, so I can turn on live view and get the perfect composition without having to be right over my camera. And since I know for this photo shoot I'm going to be using primarily the body of the guitar, I'm not as concerned with the headstock. I want to make sure that the body sits in the center of the frame so it's the sharpest and it's not too warped out. And I also want to pay attention on the orientation. I don't want the body too far off because I might see one edge of the right-hand side of the guitar while not seeing the left-hand side of the guitar. So really I want to place the middle of the guitar directly below the lens. And live view really helps with this process. And then once I have everything set, I'm going to focus, turn out of live view, and then I also want to turn off the image stabilization and the autofocus on this lens so that nothing changes. The other thing I'm going to do, because this does vibrate just a little bit, I have this camera that's relatively heavy, boomed really far out. I'm also going to put my camera into self-timer mode. And then I've set the self-timer to 5 seconds. So now I can take a picture, the camera will stabilize for 5 seconds, I can get out of the way, and it's going to take one single image. So you're probably wondering, why in the world did I set the guitar straight down and build this crazy apparatus when I could just prop it up on a wall and put the camera in a more usual orientation? And the reason for this is, one, I want to be able to cut out the guitar without having anything touching it. But more importantly, I want to be able to light this guitar from any possible angle. So by placing it straight down on this white paper and having this relatively wide open space, I'm going to be able to fire the strobe both into the ceiling, but also off on any angle so that I have the most possibilities when I take this image back into post-production. Now this guitar is super glossy and it's going to show a lot of reflections, and I'm a little worried that when I start firing the strobe, I'm going to get some color casts. So to prevent that, I've put this little V-flat right up against the wall so that any light that comes from this direction is going to be nice and white. Now for camera settings, I'm going to be shooting at f8, which is going to give me a nice depth of field. I'm also shooting at this camera's highest sync speed, which is about 1/200. Let me go ahead and take one shot so that you can see none of the lights in my room here are actually affecting this exposure. So as you can see, we have a black frame here, which guarantees that none of the light in the scene is affecting my exposure, but obviously we're going to have to light this to get anything to show up. Now, if you're trying to get into product photography, one thing that could be really frustrating is you might think that you need a bunch of different strobes to light every element of the guitar to get it perfect in camera. And I know I used to do that when I first got into photography, and it would drive me crazy. I was setting bounce cards everywhere and trying to get it perfect. But in many cases, the professionals don't do that at all. With just one strobe, I will be able to light this guitar from many different angles, and then in post-production, I can take those little elements that are perfect, combine them all together, and it's gonna save me a lot of time. And from experience, I know the final result is actually gonna look a whole lot better. So the next sponsor for this video is Westcott. They're one of the leaders in lighting for both photographers and videographers. For this shoot today, I'm gonna be using the new Westcott FJ400 strobe. This powerful light is 400 watts. It runs on a battery, so you can use it wirelessly, or if you're in a studio, you can actually plug it into the wall. At full power, it takes just 0.9 seconds to recycle, and this strobe can fire 480 times at full power on a single charge. And perhaps the coolest feature of this flash is it uses the new FJ-X2M universal trigger, which natively works for Canon, Nikon, Fujifilm, Panasonic, and Olympus. So no matter which camera you use, this trigger is gonna work on all of them, and if you're like us and have multiple cameras, it's really nice having one non-proprietary flash trigger. So now that I have everything set up and running, basically what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna walk around and light this guitar from different angles, also with different qualities of light. So the first thing I think I wanna do is I want to try to get some shots where all of the metal chrome has a nice shine to it, and I know from experience it's gonna be really hard to light up all the chrome with a hard light. So instead of putting this light in a huge softbox, I'm actually just gonna fire it into the ceiling, take a couple shots just moving around, and hopefully by firing this light into the ceiling, all the chrome is gonna be filled in with a nice highlight. It's gonna hide all the scratches that are on this guitar. And one of the tricks is to just make sure that none of the light from the flash spills onto the guitar, and that's why having one of these reflector dishes is really nice. If I were to fire this, say, this way to light up that part of the ceiling, some of this light could spill over and it's gonna make some really weird shadows and also some really ugly highlights, so you definitely don't wanna do that. So now I've taken about 5 or 6 shots firing this into the ceiling. The next thing I wanna do is I wanna start lighting the guitar further away with just hard light. So basically I'm gonna walk around the guitar, maybe a few shots I'll be 2 or 3 feet away, and then other shots, if I can afford to be, I might be 6 to 10 feet away, and I'm just gonna see if I can cast some nice shadows in different directions that I can use once I get back into Photoshop. And as I get further away, I'm having to turn the power up on this strobe, and if I shoot closer, I obviously need to turn the power down. And because the height of the light makes a huge difference, I also wanna make sure that I take some shots really high up, casting light down, but then I'm also taking shots really low to maybe cast really long shadows across the guitar. I don't know if I'm gonna be using any of these frames, but I definitely wanna have them since my camera and everything's set up. The second that the camera moves or the guitar moves, I'm not gonna be able to go back and create any of these frames later. Now, as I'm looking at some of these frames, I can tell I don't have all the gradients and some of the highlights that I want in certain parts of the frame. This is a little trick that I learned from Brian Rogers Jr. I'm gonna take a picture and I'm gonna hold this white card really close to the frame, and as you can see, I'm cutting into some of the body of the guitar, but the highlights on some of this chrome look really great. So I'm just gonna keep playing around with this. I can also see the strobe in a lot of these frames is lighting this leg of the tripod, which is actually reflecting into the guitar, so I think if I hide the tripod leg with white, I can actually get that reflection to totally blend in with the wood. I need to do another one a little higher. So I've taken about 20 different images now from every possible angle with hard light and soft light. The final thing that I want to do just to make sure that I have it is I'm going to put a grid on this light, and that's going to narrow the beam of light so that I can get really hard light streaming across the guitar. I don't know if I'm going to use this, but there might be a situation where I want to just have a little bit more highlight, say on the pick guard or on the back of the guitar, and this is going to allow me to do that. So as you can see from this shot, I'm just lighting just a little bit of the center of the guitar. I'm getting some really nice shadows, especially on the tone and volume knobs. That would be really hard to replicate in post. I don't know if I'm going to need this shot, but it's always good to have more, just in case you want to add some cool effects to your final image. So now that I've taken about 30 different shots with one single strobe light, let's go into the post-production studio and put them all together. All right guys, so here we are back in the post-production, and I'm gonna show you the workflow and the Photoshop files that I used to make this final ad. Now I have two different Photoshop files. The first one here is Final Guitar Composite, and this is basically going to be the file that I use to make the perfect looking product shot. And so I want to walk you through each layer so you can see how I used all of those images that I took in the studio to kind of bring out the best in the guitar. So the first file that I have here is just called Base Layer 1. I don't know if I ever used this, but it was a pretty ugly image, and I wanted to show you how you can set your camera up and get all these awful reflections, but with some clever lighting techniques and masking techniques, how you can turn this image into a really beautiful, well-composited shot. So if I zoom in here, you can see my tripod, my camera, everything's reflecting. There are some nice qualities about this image. I like the way that the selector switch here, all this chrome is highlighted. There's all these nice specular highlights that look really clean. The pickup and everything right here look really nice. If I zoom in here, you can actually see some of the scratches on the lacquer of the guitar. So we don't want to show any of that. So let me start by building this up. This bottom layer, I believe the flash was bounced into the ceiling, and that's going to cause the ceiling to act as a huge softbox. And you can see the shadows here. They're really, really soft, and they're kind of cast straight down. It almost has like a ring flash look to it. You have a shadow here, you have a shadow all the way around the guitar. But because of that huge reflection, it's causing a lot of problems because it's lighting up the tripod and everything. But if you compare that to this layer, this was shot with a much harder light. So the light here is off to the side, and if you zoom in, you can see all the shadows are being cast in one direction. If I zoom down here, you can see that the volume and the tone knob, they're casting shadows onto the wood itself. But when you're using hard light, you do get some really nice colors. You get a lot of punch and a lot of contrast with hard light, but with a large light source or a soft light source, you're not going to get the same contrast, but you do get a more even spread of the light. But in terms of the chrome here, soft light, especially large light sources, are going to allow you to get that reflection that's going to show the chrome off perfectly. So basically what I'm trying to say here is there's not going to be a correct solution when shooting a product shot. You're not going to want all soft light, but you're also probably not going to want all hard light. You're going to want to pick and choose different light sources, maybe even different light directions, and composite them in a way that gives you the most spectacular product shot possible. So I think the base layer that I used on this image is actually this frame here, and this is called lower body. And if we compare these two shots, you can see this one frame really solves a lot of the problems that I had. I'm able to get the chrome to be really nice, and it's highlighted in a really clean way. I also have a lot of detail out of the body. If you compare the hard light image here, the tones in the body actually I think I might prefer, but we do have that highlight. If I use the softer light, it fills in a lot better, but it's not quite as contrasty, so I'll probably deal with that here in a minute. Now, this particular frame was shot using foam core that I put up against the leg of the tripod, and that's how I was able to get rid of that highlight. You can actually see the edge of the foam core right up here in the pickup and in the top of the guitar. So I'm going to have to address that. So the second frame that I used was just another shot that was very similar, but I was able to fill in the top of the guitar here. If I hit shift and hit my mask here, you'll actually be able to see the full image. So this is the image with no masking. You're able to see the foam core right here on the bottom. You now see the tripod leg again. It does do some pretty interesting things here on the chrome plate. It has this really nice highlight all the way around with some kind of natural looking gradients. I really like the way that this looks. I didn't wind up using this frame for that, but if I turn my mask on again by hitting shift and clicking the mask, you can see I left the plate that was completely filled in, but I was able to combine two different shots so that I can get rid of this awful highlight down here on the bottom and this highlight on the top and kind of flatten everything out so that it's a much more even exposure. Now, if you're wondering how I do masks, I'm not going to go into that in a huge detail in this tutorial, but if you want to learn how to do that quickly, let's say I click on this image here, I can just come down here to this little white box with a circle. If I click that, it's going to add a mask, and it's allowing everything to shine through. If I come over to my brush and I paint with just the black brush, what it's going to do is it's going to show the image below it. And so basically by using different masks, I'm able to paint in certain areas that I want to keep while hiding other areas that I don't want to keep. I'm going to go up here and remove the layer mask because I don't want that. But let me just walk through the rest of this file. So basically that's the bulk of the body. Now I'm going to go through and start adding in some really fine details. The first one here is fret highlights. If I turn this on and off, you can see up here on the top of the guitar, it adds a really nice highlight to the frets that just make them stand out. This shot was an image where the light was to the right. If I turn off this layer mask, you can see the shadows completely change directions. I'm now lighting from the right side, so I have this shadow down here, and this image I really wasn't a fan of at all, except the highlights on the frets themselves. So if I turn my mask back on and toggle this on and off, you can see really all it is doing is just adding a little detail to the frets, and the whole goal of all of this is to make the product shot look as three-dimensional as possible. So if I zoom in here, you can see the frets kind of look a little cool to my eye. So I wanted to warm them up, and I did that by adding a color balance layer. And if I toggle this on and off, I don't know if you'll be able to see this on YouTube, but basically all I did was I brought up some of the yellow tones and the mid-tones, and if I go to the highlights, I brought up some yellow as well, and I pulled out some cyan. And what that just does is it just gives those frets a little bit more of a copper warm color, because I just felt like it was a little too blue. You might not be able to see it very clearly in the video, but that's what it's doing. The next layer is the pickup layer. So obviously you can see the foam core in this top pickup. So I found another frame that was almost perfect, and it has that really shiny silver look to it. So I just used that. If I turn off that layer mask, you can see this frame was pretty ugly as well. This actually might be the bottom base layer that I showed you at the beginning of this. You can also see some other things I did. I was adding a little bounce cards to allow some reflections in the tuner knobs. For this particular image, I'm not going to use the headstock of the guitar. All of these techniques would apply if you wanted to get one perfect guitar shot, but since the ad that I'm focusing on is just going to have the bottom of the guitar, I'm going to ignore a lot of the headstock in this image. But you can see, really ugly frame, but the pickup looked really nice. Let me turn that back on. And you can see there, it's just doing that one little function right there. The next image I'm going to turn on is top wood. Let me see what this did. Okay, and so what you can see here is by using the fill card, the foam core in the previous base images, some of my blacks are getting a little washed out, and I'm losing some of that punchiness of the colors and contrast that I liked from the hard light. So if I turn this on, you can see it's just making my blacks a little punchier. It's also giving a little bit more color saturation and pop in the wood. If I turn this layer mask off, you can see this was actually shot with a grid on the Westcott light. And so it's not even lighting up any of the frets and the headstock, but it was creating this really punchy, cool look. You have a little bit of reflection of the tripod down here, but I really like this. There's probably a whole ad that you could create just with hard light where you get these nice shadows and everything coming off. I do like a lot of the tonality of this frame, but for this particular composite, I'm just using that frame just to give me the littlest bit of contrast on the edge. This next frame, I've labeled this as chrome wood, and what this is doing is it's giving me a little bit more detail on the right side here of the chromed plate. And the other thing this frame is doing is it's adding just a little bit more contrast to the saddles here where the guitar strings actually go through the body of the guitar. And I believe if I turn this layer mask off, I believe the way this was shot was I had moved the foam core over to the right-hand side of the guitar and almost draped it into the frame. You can see right here this shadow that's being cast. I believe this is the edge of the foam core. And so I'm able to fill in all of the shadows here. So you can imagine if this piece of foam core was not right next to the guitar, the shadow would be much more similar to the shadow up here. It would probably go really dark. But again, that foam core is just adding all of these nice highlights. So the lesson to learn here is use your foam core and really bend it and move it around to get the perfect reflection. A lot of times I'll take 5 to 10 shots just with the smallest little variation in that angle because you never know how it's going to fill in some of the areas that you might want brighter. The next layer is another color balance. I just felt like this chrome looked a little purple or a little blue, and so I just turned another color balance on that I locked down to only that last image. And you can do that by, if you come right here in between the two layers and you hit Alt, you'll get this little arrow. If I turn that off, it's going to add the color balance to the entire image. Now you can see all of the wood everywhere is getting much warmer globally, but I only wanted to apply that to the previous layer below. I just wanted to warm up this little bit of wood and kind of warm up the chrome itself. So if I hit Alt and come in between the two layers, I can pin this color balance only to the previous layer, and now if I turn it on, you can see it's only affecting a very small part of the image. So on this Photoshop file, you're going to see a bunch of adjustment layers that are going to only affect very small portions of the image. Now the next layer is called Screws and Pickup. Now if I turn this on and off, I felt like the chrome highlight on this top neck pickup was just too bright. And when I saw this frame, in my mind, it made the pickup look a little more natural. It still shows the chrome or the nickel. I'm not sure what this pickup's actually made out of, but it just brought the tonality back to a place that I liked a little bit better. So, you know, depending on taste, you could have used this image. I preferred this one, but another thing that it did is I felt like the way the light was hitting this frame, it just made the screws look a little shinier. So what I did with this layer is I just painted the entire thing black so none of it would show through, and then with the white brush I just went through and popped each one of these screws so that they just were a little bit brighter. And I also painted the neck pickup white so that it would shine through and allow me just to have a little bit more texture. If I really zoom in here, you can see what this is doing, which I think makes it look a little more natural. I just like that frame a little bit better. If I come up here to the next frame, this is for the strings, and this is really subtle, but you can see a nice highlight, especially down here on top of the black pickup. You can see it just gives a little bit more punch to the strings. On top of my chrome neck pickup, it's adding that. And the way that I did that, this was kind of a clever idea that I had. I just put a piece of black cardboard, construction paper, underneath the strings so that it would block out all of the guitar. And then I fired a light off to camera left so that it would give a nice highlight onto my strings. Unfortunately, these strings weren't brand new, but I think if you were shooting products for real, you'd put brand new strings on so they'd have the most punch and glisten to them. But by doing this and then changing my blend mode down here to lighten, what it's going to do is it's going to allow only the brightest parts of that frame to shine through, and then with a layer mask, I can get it to where only the brightest part of those strings shine through. So I thought that was really cool, and it really helps make some contrast when it's against some black here. So to show you how big of a difference all these layers played in the final image, I put everything into a single folder. You can come down here and make folder and label it. It makes it really nice to organize your Photoshop file. If I minimize everything just to this guitar folder and then turn this off and on, you can see this is the hard light shot that had a lot of problems with it. And then here's the final composited shot. Let me zoom in just a little bit so you can see the part of the image that I'm going to use. If I turn off the hard light image and show you this image, which obviously has got a lot of problems with it, you can see how big of a difference it makes. So what I did now is I hit Shift Control Alt E, and that is going to stamp all of the images into a single file. So now I can turn off all of my layers, and I basically have one final composited shot. And then using this stamped layer, basically what I did was I made a final mask. I want to cut this entire image off of the white so that it can be layered on top of other images to make my final ad campaign. And this particular guitar, this Telecaster, it's got this white binding around it. So I wanted to make sure that I got that included because it's a major feature of this guitar. Not all Telecasters have that white binding. So if I turn on my red layer here, this is just a single layer that I painted red so I could see a lot of contrast and find out if I messed up any of the mask. I also just cut off the headstock there since I didn't really focus on that part of the guitar. And you can see this looks pretty good. You have this little black area of just the inside of the horn of the guitar there. And then I got that nice binding all the way around. I was still able to get that little button down there on the bottom. And then I used the button, I think from our base layer. I like the highlight on that. So this is my final masked layer that I'm going to use in the ad, but I don't think I'm going to keep it at that same orientation. I just laid it on the paper diagonally so that I could have the most amount of guitar on the sheet of paper. So I hope you guys found that part pretty interesting. I think you can see just how powerful it is using something like a single studio strobe and lighting a product from many different angles and then using all of those images to composite one single image together. You're going to be able to get results that were just really difficult to do if you tried to do it all in camera with dozens of lights perfectly placed. I think this will save you a lot of time if you want to try to build product shots like this. But now that I have my final product shot, the next thing I want to do is create an entire, Fender Telecaster ad. Now, since I'm here in quarantine and I don't have access to a bunch of files and I can't go out and shoot the perfect images for my own ad campaign, I'm going to treat this more or less as if I was a photographer hired to shoot the product shot, but then I'm going to send the images off to an advertising agency, and together with some stock imagery, we're going to be able to create an ad that might actually be published in a magazine or on a website. So let me show you how I would approach that. So here we are in the final ad campaign Photoshop file, and I'm going to show you a bunch of images that I scouted on iStockphoto.com, and some of these I purchased, and then others I just threw in here just to give me an idea of what I could do in post-production and see if that will give me the vibe that I'm looking for. So on this layer, I just have placed my guitar, I've spun it around, I've zoomed in, I've put it predominantly on the right-hand side of a frame that I think would fit well for an ad. And now the next step is I want to figure out which type of background do I want to put in this. The first idea that I had was something like this. Let's just buy a stock image of some smoke. Maybe I could even shoot something like this here in the studio and go just the most simple route possible. But when I look at this, especially up here in the Navigator, and I look at it small, it just kind of felt cheesy. It felt like perhaps the easiest possible thing to do. So I wasn't really sold on this idea. So the next idea that I had was, what if I made this ad look like the guitar had just been created and it hasn't even left the factory? So I went around iStock and I looked for some images, and I found some images like this, and I thought this looked really cool. I love the window over here, I love the lighting direction, and the original file had this guy in it, and then I retouched him out a little bit. I cleaned up the window, and if I come back up here and place my guitar back in this was the original idea that I thought. Maybe I could put a tagline up here like "Legends last forever," or something that would play on the idea that Fender guitars have been around for ages. I felt like this was kind of a cool ad campaign. I don't know, I wanted to do some other things with it, and to be honest, I don't like these boards in the front. I don't like how dirty they look. I think if you were trying to show this guitar coming straight out of a factory, I would want boards that would look like the highest level of quality. And I was kind of bummed out with this bottom part of the image. But let me show you something I did do with this image that I think was pretty cool. I used some layer masks to create some gradients. And gradients allow you to give a lot of three-dimensionality and to hide some parts of your background plate that you don't want. And the easiest way to make one of these gradients is to just come down here to the little half circle, and if I select maybe levels or curves, and then I do the Alt click trick so that it's only being applied to my bottom layer, and then if I double click this right up here, I can come in here and I can play around with the level. I can also use these sliders here to kind of give it a washed out look, or say some of my highlights are just too bright. I can bring them down, and you can see like this wood, look what it's doing to that. It's taking it from a really bright white look to now just making it a little more subdued. And then I can come over here to my layer mask, and if I select my gradient tool, I can now come in here and just drag my gradient. Let me turn these other masks off so that you can see what this looks like a little bit better. This is the original file, and then if I use my gradient tool, if I drag really long, I can make a nice subtle variation, but if I go really short, I can give a really hard edge here. If I go really short, it's almost like a straight line. So essentially what I can do is just layer a bunch of these on top of each other, and because they have these soft edges, it allows me to make some really nice gradients that bring all the attention exactly where I want it in the frame. So I'm going to be using a lot of these gradients throughout this image. I'm going to put some on top of the guitar, I'm going to put some on top of the background, and play around with those to help fade the image in perfectly. But let's look at some of the other backgrounds that I thought about using. So there's the smoke. Another idea I had was to use a stage and have the guitar kind of like it was ready to be played on a stage. So I went through iStock and found a lot of different images that had that vibe to it. I thought this one was pretty cool. I love the tonality of the blue against the warmth of the guitar. And when I saw this, I thought, you know what would be really cool is to put a Fender amp right behind the guitar, almost like the guitar was set up on the amp, resting, and it was waiting to be picked up and taken to the stage. And as I looked at this image, I thought, well, I need a shot that's taken very low to the ground, because if I put an amp right here in the background, the way these lines are going from the stage, you can tell this background plate was shot with the camera, I don't know, 4 or 5 feet up off the ground. It wasn't set really low. With this image, you can tell the camera's positioned much lower, and I really like that vibe. So I wasn't sure that this was going to work either. So the next image that I found was this shot of a stage. This actually has a guy's leg here. He's playing. There's a pedal board in front of him. And I was like, this is definitely a backplate that could work for this. And so I bought this image. I think on iStock you can buy these images for like, I think this was $33. And then I thought, you know, I don't know if I like this monitor here. Let me show you what this looked like. I didn't think I really liked that monitor there, so I just cloned out the monitor. I also took out this little coiled guitar. Let me put the guitar back in. And I felt like that looked pretty good. Then again, I added some gradients to the back plate. I also wanted to blow out this highlight a little bit more, so I went with something like that. So that's one option that I thought was pretty cool. The other option that I went with, I found this image of a crowd, which has a totally different vibe. I mean, this is kind of playing off that warm feel. This image, it's almost got this steel color, very desaturated. The only real colors are these reds from the crowd. I like this a lot too, so I think there's potential here as well. So that was another image off of iStock that I bought. And I called this one Stage Cool, and then the one below it Stage Warm. And then as I got playing around with this, I thought, what if I put a Fender amp right behind the guitar? Now, unfortunately, I don't own a Fender amp here, otherwise I would just photograph that. So I had to go back to stock imagery to complete the rest of this. I know that doesn't really seem like the best thing to do as a photographer, but trust me, I would be happy to shoot a Fender amp if I had one. I just didn't. So I found this blackface amp. And the reason this is called a blackface amp is it's literally got a black face on the top of the amp, but then it's also characterized by this silver face cloth. The speaker would actually be right here. So when I look at this image, I think, man, this has a lot of potential. The amp is able to hide the musician's leg. I guess I have some of the foot in there, but as I look at this small up here in the preview screen, I'm thinking this has a lot of potential. I mean, that looks pretty cool. But let me see what other amp options I could find. I found another tweed amp. Let me turn off my blackface. And here's a tweed amp that looks pretty cool. And this is tweed because it's the material that the amp is made out of. And then you can see the grill cloth has these brown tones. And I thought, you know, that looks pretty cool too. I love that the Fender logo is showing, so I don't have to put the logo somewhere else. And I don't know, this image just has more of a modern feel, where this amp is starting to feel a little more vintage. And then I found this amp, which is the back of the amp, which I thought, you know, if you're a photographer taking an image this way towards the crowd, you wouldn't actually see the front of the amp because it would be turned away from the audience. So you would see the back of the amp, but you know, this image is just, it's not quite as beautiful. So I had to compromise and say, you know what, let me have the amp facing the opposite way. Doesn't totally make sense, but I thought that would look better. And then the final amp that I found was this old tweed amp. And if you compare these two, the new with the old, especially if I turn the guitar off, I just loved how beat up this amp looked, and I thought that was just super cool. So I wound up going with this amp, and then I put the guitar in front of it. Let me just show you a few things I did with the amp. I added another levels here, and I kind of painted in some shadows. I also used the gradients to kind of give this amp some more texture. If I turn all these gradients off, here's the original image. You can see it doesn't blend in well at all. So I just started adding layer masks with a gradient to try to give it some definition and to make it feel like it might have been lit in the studio and have the same kind of feel that the guitar had. So when I compared the two background plates, I wound up going with the warmer toned image. I felt like this just fit the ad campaign a little bit better. I do really love this, and I love the contrast of the guitar being up against a more muted black and white type of image. But for this ad, let's stay with the warm tone. So that's pretty much the final ad. The only other thing I want to show you guys is I just wanted to add some other gradients and some tones to give this whole image a look so that it felt like it wasn't necessarily 3 or 4 images just cut out and pasted on top of each other. I believe I took the amp and I just added a Gaussian blur by coming up here to filter and blur, and I just made the amp slightly more blurry so that it felt like it was sitting behind the guitar. The other thing I wanted to do is I wanted to add a little bit more warmth over the entire image. So I added this layer here, which is a color fill. And if I toggle this on and off, you can see it's pretty subtle. It's just bringing some warmth to the amp and to the guitar, and it's also layering that same warmth over the background plate. If you want to create one of these, you can come down here to your adjustment layers and come up to solid color. Of course, you can also come up here to layer and go to new adjustment layer, and you can hit, I think photo filter does the same thing, but I just did a color fill. And then I painted off some of the color on the guitar so that it didn't affect it too much. You can see that layer mask here. And then I set it to overlay. If I do normal, you can see it's just way too strong. But if I come down to overlay, it's a little more subtle. And then I brought the opacity down to 30. If I keep it up to 100%, it's just way too contrasty. All my colors are blowing out. Somewhere around 30% feels pretty natural. And then I also added another levels where I just played with a gradient, and this one it adds a lot of darkness and kind of vignetting to the left side of the frame because I'm going to add some text here. And then I select everything and hit Shift Control Alt E, and that gives me this final layer that I can now play around with a little bit more. Now for the final look, you can see these next layers. I used Exposure X5. They are not a sponsor of this video, but I do use this effect on every single image. If I come down here to Filter and go to Exposure X5 Software, they have all of these different film presets that just make your image look like film. It's giving it a color grade and changing the colors just enough to where it makes the image feel like one complete image. It also adds some grain and that sort of stuff. And then you can come down here to overlays, and they have different things like lighting effects. So if I wanted to put a color burn on the image, I could do that. For my final image, I came down here to texture, and I went down to scratches, and I thought it just looked kind of cool to have some scratches on the final image. So I played around with that, and then I hit apply. I'm going to discard these changes, but I'm going to show you the final image that I used here. So if I turn this layer on and off, you can see what it did. It decreased a little bit of the saturation and gave a little haze over the guitar. It added these scratches, which I just felt like made the image a little more edgy. If you're a guitar player, scratches and old photographs and edgier type of ad campaigns are always really popular. You'll look at a lot of guitar ads, and I mean, they crush the blacks and blow out the highlights. They definitely put a lot more contrast in. They're not going for a perfect photographic image usually. So I was trying to add that to this final image. And then let me turn on the text. I came up with a couple different slogans. I'm not the best copy editor, but I thought bedroom, basement, ballroom, almost like you'd started off in the bedroom and this setup works well there, and then you could move to your basement, and then maybe you're now playing at the big ballroom. I don't know if that makes any sense, but I just thought maybe that would be some text that Fender would use. And then I added another text line, the all new Tele Plus. Now this guitar came out in 1996, 97, so they don't make this guitar anymore, but if they were to do an ad campaign, they'd probably write something like this. And then made in the USA. I looked at a bunch of Fender ads to see what type of text they typically put on their ads, and these were all things that I felt like were on a majority of ads, and then they'd probably put their logo down here. I don't want to get into that on this video, but I do have their logo here on the amp itself. So I don't know if this font is my absolute favorite. I can't tell if it looks cheesy or if it looks realistic, but maybe if I spent more time downloading some free fonts, I could get this perfect. But something like this is pretty cool. Now, I'm not a big fan of making fake tear sheets and putting them on your website and acting like you had Fender as a client, but I might remove the text, I might remove the Fender logo, and I still might use an image like this to show what I'm capable of doing as a photographer. There's probably some ethics there between using stock imagery, but if you're working for an advertising agency, in many cases, they may ask you to shoot just the guitar, or they may ask you just to shoot the guitar and the amp, and then they will use stock imagery to build up a final ad campaign. And it's strange, if you look at a lot of photographers' portfolios that do this kind of stuff, you'd be shocked that like maybe they didn't shoot the guitar, but they shot the back plate, or maybe they shot the amp and the guitar, but not the back plate. But when you see the final composited image and they use that tear sheet in their own portfolio, you would think, oh, the photographer took all of these images, but maybe they just took the image of the celebrity or the superhero, or maybe they took the shot from the movie and it's been composited by the graphic design team, and only portions of those images were actually what the photographer took themselves. So I hope you guys enjoyed this long tutorial. This is a long video. I gotta say thanks to Tamron and thanks for Westcott for sponsoring this video. And I would encourage you guys, if you're stuck in your house right now and you can't get out and do portraits, or you can't shoot weddings, or some of the other genres that you might make a living with, definitely consider looking around your house for some products that would be interesting to photograph. Or you could even buy products off Amazon, have them shipped to you, and come up with some really creative concepts like this. Now, obviously, I spent my own money to buy some back plates to create an image like this, but maybe you already have a library of images that you've taken that would be able to work perfectly for something like this. Or you could go into your studio or into a dark room, and maybe you could do something a lot more conceptual by using blurred lights or LED panels. Really, the sky's the limit. But I hope that this has opened up your eyes. If you guys want to learn from one of the best product photographers I've ever worked with, head over to fstoppers.com/store and check out our tutorial we did with Brian Rogers Jr. He does nothing but product shots, and his tutorial is amazing. I actually used a lot of the techniques in this photo shoot that I had learned from him, so definitely check that out. And if you guys have any images like this that you've been making while in quarantine, head over to fstoppers.com/community and upload your pictures to your own profile. I would love to check out what you guys are creating while we're in this weird environment where we can't leave the house. So I hope you guys are doing well and staying safe out there, and hopefully I'll be producing more content like this very soon. So stay safe, guys.